Hello, I'm Robin Whalley, welcome to Lenscraft. Last week, DxO relaunched the Nik Collection with lots of bug fixes in there, but no enhancements. Despite that, I thought I'm going to start working a little bit more with the Nik Collection because I've used it a lot in the past, and I'd sort of forgotten how good it was. Today what I want to do is demonstrate 4 techniques that you can use to dramatically enhance your photographs. And I'm going to use the landscape scene that you see on screen at the moment, and I'm going to turn it into this. Now, if you're a landscape photographer, there are only broadly 4 techniques that you need to learn using the Nik Collection, and I'm going to show you what these enhancements are, and that's how we're going to create the image that you see on screen now. So if you want to know more, let's get straight underway with the first technique. The first technique we're going to look at is how to make the details in your image really pop. This is how we're going to add a sense of feeling and depth into the image. Now, in this particular image, we need to look at the rocks in the foreground here and make those stand out, really enhance the detail. We also want to look at some of the foreground trees and enhancing those. What we want to try to avoid though is this distant hill here and enhancing that, because if we apply our filter to the distant hills and try to make those details pop, then it will lose a sense of reality in our image. So the nearer something is to you, the more detail you should be able to see in it. The other thing we should avoid is adding detail into the sky at this stage, because all it will do with these filters is enhance the noise that might be there. So importantly, we're going to be applying our adjustments using control points, and also in this case masks, so that we can precisely target our adjustment. The filters we're going to use to do this are the Color Effects Pro and also Nik Viveza. And we're going to start with Color Effects Pro. Color Effects Pro really is a collection of different filters for adding different effects. The one we need to look at is this, the Pro Contrast filter. And it's found here on the left hand side. And in particular, we need to be looking at using the Dynamic Contrast filter. Now, as I increase this, you can see that it adds in detail of dynamic contrast into these areas. It also, though, is adding it across the entire image. So what we need to do is make selections using control points. And all I'm doing here is holding down the Alt key and using it to duplicate my control points. And that's made a reasonable selection here. It has though highlighted still some of the sky and some of the distant hills, because those are white at the moment, and that means they're being selected. So we can use these negative control points and add those in, and that will reduce the selections in those areas. It doesn't matter too much because we'll use a mask once we're in Photoshop. And now you can see that the adjustment is being applied here, but not to the other areas. We can turn the filter off just so you can see the difference. Now notice as well that when we're enhancing detail in this way, it's also opening up the shadow areas and making the image appear slightly lighter. Sometimes this can make your contrast in the image appear to reduce, so you can actually use this correct contrast just to add in more contrast if you want. We're not going to do that here because we're going to take the image into Viveza and we'll enhance it further there. At this point I can use the brush button, and that will allow me to go back into Photoshop and actually use the brush tools in Nik that are now working. But I'm not going to do that because I'm very familiar with Photoshop and masking, so I'm just going to select the OK button. I'll add the mask manually. If I want to fine-tune the selection now, I can add my mask, and I'll actually invert it by pressing Ctrl and I on my keyboard. The reason I've done this is that the majority of the area of the image I don't want to select, so I'm going to hide any effect with a black mask. I'm then going to be able to paint with white using a white brush and a reasonably high opacity, and that means I can actually target my adjustments onto the rocks as I want. So I'm just going to increase my brush size, and now I'm just painting with white onto the areas of the rock that I want to enhance. And as I'm doing this, you can see my mask thumbnail here is showing the areas I've selected. That's the detail on the rocks enhanced. I'm just going to lower my opacity now slightly, and I'm going to start to paint in on the tree area here that I want to enhance. And that's already added a feeling of depth to the image. In a moment, we're going to look at our next technique, and when we do that, we'll probably use a similar adjustment to enhance the rock detail further, but I'll show you that in a moment. We've already seen that using the dynamic contrast slider in the Pro Contrast filter can enhance and open shadows, but sometimes you need a little bit more. For example, this rock here is very dark in the image and it's actually distracting. So what we want to do is open the shadows and bring out some of the hidden details. Unfortunately, when people do this, they tend to create an unnatural look, but I'm going to show you now how to overcome this through a combination of different sliders, and the tool we're going to use to do this is Viveza. Now, because we're aiming to target and adjust just part of the image, again we're going to focus on using control points, and we'll add our first control point here to the rock. Now I'm holding down the control key as I resize my adjustment, and that allows me to see where the mask is being created by Viveza. So the white areas are being selected, the dark areas aren't, and that's where my adjustment will target. Now, the mistake a lot of people make when trying to open up shadows is just to use the brightness slider, or they'll use this shadow adjustment slider, and it can actually make the image look very false in that area. Now, the way we're going to make our adjustment is using a combination of sliders, and we're going to start by using the two sliders I've just shown you. So we'll start by opening up some shadow adjustment in that area, and we'll also add in a little bit of brightness. Now, the secret here is to also use the contrast adjustment. Notice how that suddenly makes the rock appear much brighter, and also the structure slider, which lightens it even further. Now, once you've done those adjustments, now you can actually reduce the other sliders until you create the natural appearance of a rock with a bit of detail there. So that's actually improved the situation quite a lot in that area. So there's the original, and now here's the adjustment. Now, the only problem with what's just been applied here is that it's spilled over a little bit into this surrounding area. Now, the way we can control that and stop it from happening is by applying another control point just to that area. And this control point makes a selection around the first one. Notice now how the area around here and here is being selected by this control point, which has no adjustments on it. The other control point, though, I'll just show you, is still selecting the rocks and applying our adjustment to it. So overall, we've created an adjustment that's targeted just on that area and has opened up the shadow detail in that rock. Now, the other thing that we said we would do is apply some further contrast and structure enhancement to the rocks in the foreground. This is to make the detail pop even more, even though we applied a lot of detail adjustment in the Colour Effects Pro filter. And all I'm going to do is add in more contrast and more structure into these areas. And again, I'm going to hold down my Alt key and I'm going to use that to duplicate the control points and create that effect. Again, if I turn off the preview, you can see we've created much more detail in the foreground, but it fades out nicely into the distant hills and also into the sky, which remain quite smooth. Now I'm just going to open up the shadow details a little bit further on there with the brightness slider, and I'm also going to just duplicate that control point over onto this rock here. And that creates the look, I think, that will suit the image once we apply our further adjustments. Now that I'm happy with that, I'll just select OK and I'm back into Photoshop. Again, as I did before, I can add a mask and paint in the details into the areas that I want. So I'm going to add the mask, and now with the white brush I can paint in my details. I'll just check that. So we can see the detail we've painted in there. We can see that we've opened up the shadows here, and that's actually looking like a very natural adjustment. If you're a landscape photographer, I'm sure you'll have shot lots of sunsets and sunrises, and you probably use a neutral density graduated filter, as I did here. I placed the filter over the sky because the sky was so bright it was turning the ground dark, and the exposure difference between the two was beyond the range of the camera. Even though I did this, I've not ended up with the intensity of sunset that I seem to remember at the time when I shot the image. Being able to enhance the sunset again to make it match my memory is something that is a key skill and something you need to be able to do. Nik Collection gives us two sets of filters that we can use to do this, and the first one we're going to use is in the Color Effects Pro filter. The filter we want to use is the Skylight filter, and that's found over here on the left. Now immediately I've added that, you can see that it's boosted up the adjustment or the strength of the sunset in a lot of areas, but it also makes the sky appear purple. So what we need to do is add it selectively with a control point. And here I'm using it just to add into certain points in the image where we've got a lot of orange. But it's still spilling over into some of the other areas, so I'm going to add in on the blue the adjustment or a negative control point here to prevent the adjustment spilling over. And again, I'll just duplicate that onto other areas where I want to stop the effect being seen. And what this does is it creates a nice colour contrast between the orange in the clouds and the blue in the sky, and that makes for a really nice sunset appearance. And then we can increase the strength of it if we wish. The other area that I want to add some skylight filter to is this area of the trees, to make it appear as if the sun is shining directly onto them, because it was at the time, it's just that it seems to have lost a lot of that intensity in this image. And we'll add some also to this heather in the foreground, and then we'll make that even more intense, and we'll compare that to our original. So that was the image a moment ago. That's the image now, which is looking much better. There is some of the effect spilling over onto this rock here, and I'm just going to hide that for the moment. I'm happy with that, and that is the start of our sunset enhancement. So we'll accept it. Now our next adjustment is actually in Viveza, and it's the two combined that adds the strength of feeling to the sunset. And again, we want to work selectively. And we'll start by enhancing the sky. As I'm back in Viveza, I can use the control key to see what I'm selecting, and we'll add warmth this time into the image. And now we'll duplicate that control point with our Alt key, and we'll bring it down onto the trees here in the foreground. And we'll actually add a little bit more warmth in to that area, and we'll add in a little bit more contrast as well to make it appear that the sun is shining directly onto these trees. I'm seeing over here that a lot of warmth has been added into this shadow area and it was turning purple, so again, I want to select that. I'm happy to add a little bit of warmth but not too much. And again, some of the sky is turning just a little bit too purple, and we will increase the saturation of the blue in that area. And that's created a nice warm feeling with the image. So let's look at the preview, and you can see immediately that that's added quite a good feeling to the image. Now some of it is spilling over still onto these rocks, and I'm just going to hide that with the adjustment to prevent it looking a little bit purple and unnatural. The rocks at the time were quite blue and dark, and if we apply some orange to it, then it starts to change the hue of the rocks and become purple and looking a little bit odd. But that's quite a nice appearance as we've got it there, and I'm going to accept that. Now I'm just going to select both of these layers, holding down my Shift key, and I'm just going to put them into a folder. And that's just so that I can hide the sunset effect and show you the difference that's made to the image. The final adjustment we're going to apply now is to target and intensify the colours in the image, and we're going to do this using Viveza again. Now the mistake a lot of people make when they want to intensify colours is that they reach for the saturation slider and just push that up, and as you can see here, what it does is it makes the colours look first unnatural, and secondly it tends to lose any sort of detail in those areas. And what you want is not something becoming almost a blur of colour. You want a soft graduation of the colours in those areas, and that's what we're going to do now. Now one of the problems you get with colour is that the lighter a colour becomes, the less saturated it appears, and we can use that to our advantage. Let's select some of the colour in the sky, and we'll start with this area here. I'm holding down my control key again so that I can see the selection, and now I'm going to reduce the brightness of that area, and as I do, it really intensifies that colour. Again, I'm going to copy my control point and I'm going to then move it onto other areas of colour. Now that's a little bit too strong in terms of how much it's darkening that area, so you may have to adjust each of these control points individually. And I'm going to add a control point here just to prevent the darkening effect becoming too intense on those clouds and drawing the eye a little bit out of the frame. I'm also going to start to darken around the edges a little bit so that I draw the eye of the viewer into this area here and through the scene. And again there, we've got just a little bit too much shadow in that area, and we want to warm it up, and we will increase the saturation in that area because it's localized. Now this area of rock here actually has a lot more colour in it than it appears. If I select that, so you can see it being selected there, and then darken it down, the colour intensifies again. So with a few small tweaks there, we've actually intensified the appearance of the colour throughout the scene. And then once you've done that, that's when you can enhance the colour further using some saturation, but you've got to be subtle because it can increase the saturation too far. Another tip you can use when you want to intensify colours is sometimes intensifying the contrast will also boost and lift the colours. And you've probably seen already that some of the areas that we've added colour to are just a little bit too intense now. So we may reduce that saturation down just a little bit overall. Let's compare that to our starting image. There we've given a feeling of much more intense colour, but for only very minor adjustment. Let's now take that back into Photoshop. And if I turn all the other layers off, we can compare our adjusted image, which is that, with our starting image. And with those simple adjustments and techniques that we've covered, we've made a substantial difference to the image. Now what I didn't show you at the start of this video was the original image. The image we were looking at was one that had already been worked on in Lightroom, and if I reset this, there you can see the original starting image, which I'm sure you'll agree is a substantial difference to the finished image. I hope you found this helpful, and if you liked it, please give it a thumbs up below. Also, please share the video with other photographers who might find it useful. And if you haven't done so already, don't forget to subscribe. I'm Whalley, you've been watching Lenscraft. I'll see you in the next video.